With the Ardennes, one had to always, the possibility there would be a counterattack.
At night they would what they call stonk. You get these flaming onions of shells coming over and different things, and you just batten down.
We realised, of course, how formidable the German army was.
You're never defeated unless you admit it.
El Alamein and Normandy. Battles that shaped the future of the world. Dunkirk, Monte Cassino, and Arnhem. In World War II Revisited, we go back with soldiers who fought on both sides of those epic struggles. Men who 60 years ago were deadly enemies meet now, sometimes for the first time, at the scenes of some of the most momentous battles of the Second World War. In this program, an Englishman and a German come face to face in the Ardennes, the quiet region in Belgium that was the scene of Hitler's last gamble in the West during 1944.
After the D-Day landings, I think there was a great deal of jubilation in England, and they thought that the war was taking a good course, that it would be ended soon. And I think they really thought there that it was quite easy going here.
Yeah.
And it wasn't. There were some terribly fierce battles, and a lot of blood was shed.
Yeah.
The late months of 1944 brought nothing but bad news for Adolf Hitler and the Third Reich. By then, there was virtually no hope of Germany winning the war that the Führer had started with such zeal 5 years earlier. And everywhere he looked, his enemies were closing in. On the Eastern Front, Soviet forces were advancing relentlessly towards Germany. To the south, Italy had been lost. And in the west, the Allied armies were pushing on through France and the Low Countries after the successful D-Day landings. Making a mockery of the promise that no bombs would fall on German territory, her towns and cities were being pounded day and night by Allied bombers. Hitler himself was now living in a bubble of self-delusion and fantasy that dictated German strategy. In July 1944, he had somehow survived an attempt to kill him by desperate and disillusioned officers of the German army. Now he saw treachery, cowardice, and incompetence at every turn. There was, though, one last chance to salvage something from the wreckage. A final opportunity to win time for Germany to develop the new V2 terror weapon and a breathing space for its armies to regroup. Hitler planned that his last great gamble would be an offensive in the picturesque Ardennes region of Belgium.
During the day, you couldn't show yourself, because at that time we didn't know whether the American units had set up forward posts in the woods, because opposite us the land rose up steeply. The mountains were called the Ardennes.
The Ardennes was no stranger to the bitter fighting that characterized the latter stages of World War II. Through it ran the infamous German West Wall, known to the Allies as the Siegfried Line. This was the defensive line that the Allies had to breach if they were ever to set foot on German soil as they advanced from the west. Nearly 60 years on, at this section of the Siegfried Line, we brought together Gordon Newton, a veteran of the 9th British Para Division, and Klaus Schulz, then of the German 353rd Infantry Division.
Hello.
Klaus, nice to meet you in the middle of the Siegfried Line.
Very glad to meet you here, also in a place which was actually our location in September 1944.
I'm not so sure I'd like to meet you then. You probably had me in your sights and dispelled any belief I had in immortality.
Even though the Siegfried Line had become virtually obsolete by 1944, Klaus and the other German soldiers manning it knew it was the last line of defense for Germany in the West.
The things which you see here, these concrete structures, are actually were supposed to be tank obstacles. This one is the line, actually 5 trains of these things, and the part of the Siegfried Line, or in German we call it the West Wall, which run for about 630 miles from Switzerland to the Netherlands. And it was a mixture of these tank obstacles and concrete bunkers. The Americans called them pillboxes because of the shape of those bunkers. And there were 14,000 actually of them.
The company was divided amongst the West Wall bunkers, and the bunkers hadn't been used for several years. They were damp, clammy, and smelled musty.
We realised, of course, how formidable the German army was. There was a certain amount of anxiety, because we knew they wouldn't give in. They wouldn't give an inch unless they had to. We were the same, of course.
The Allied forces, which had advanced so swiftly during July and August of 1944, were now up against a regrouped German army, intent on defending the fatherland.
Initially the attacks also with tanks, but there were some Germans with Panzerfaust, and when the first Panzerfaust was shot, well, the tanks turned tails, and there were no tanks for quite a while.
If a tank was destroyed with a Panzerfaust, that often happened at close quarters, and it was hit and burned. Then you saw the hatch go up, because the tank was standing still. You heard the screams. But they were soon silenced. One man might get out through the hatch. But almost all the men inside were injured with burns.
In the autumn of 1944, there were costly battles fought in the area around Aachen and in the Hürtgen forest. Klaus Schulz was just 17 when he was transferred to the front line and into the Hürtgen forest.
Do you think you would lose Germany to the Allies?
At that time, not at that time, not yet. I thought that we would have a chance to drive them back. I would have been satisfied if they just would have gone back to Belgium and settled there. Yeah. So I mean, that this was all wrong, that came later.
In the forest, the Germans had control of dams, which the Allies realized could be breached to create havoc for miles around. The celebrated Dam Busters air raid in May 1943 had demonstrated the awesome destructive power of millions of gallons of water, and the Allies were determined not to have the tables turned on them. The Allies' aim of capturing the dams meant that there was bloody fighting between American and German troops in the appalling, claustrophobic conditions of the thick woodland.
We were just listening in for strange noises. And immediately when somebody started shooting next to you, you started also shooting. You, never mind what that was, you know, you didn't know. You cannot, in such a forest, you cannot attack with a regiment. That's impossible, because that will be split within minutes into perhaps 20 to 25 sections. And easily what would result that in would be friendly fire.
Wenn unheimlich viele Verluste gehabt hatten, dann ging mal.
If there had been a great many losses, then there was a short ceasefire. Or someone with a Red Cross flag stood up or waved. And then there was no more firing. And the Yanks said, "Go on and fetch your wounded." And the Americans took away their dead.
Thick pine trees, 100 feet tall, formed what appeared to be a roof over the forest, making it dark and gloomy, even on bright days. There was little undergrowth, and the lower limbs of the trees interlocked, so that men had to stoop as they fought their way forward. Fog, sleet, rain, and snow added to their difficulties. The stubbornness of the German defenders meant that the Americans had to use several different methods to try and break through their fortifications.
In one case, there had been a bazooka actually on that machine gun sticking out there, or on the entrances. Other modes were working a flamethrower on a pillbox. And later in the war, by November, the Americans came out with a concrete piercing shell, and that also worked that way.
The high concentration of forces in this relatively small area, coupled with the static nature of the fighting, means that even today, artifacts from the battle are still being found and recovered in the forest.
And this was actually very tricky, this one, because it's some sort that had the idea to go off as a gun wanted, not as you wanted.
That's right. And this is the American who was found in 1998.
Yes, in January. Yeah.
He won't need it again, will he?
The battle in the Hurtgen forest dragged on for 3 months and was still raging when Hitler decided to turn defense into attack. On December the 16th, 1944, he launched his last major offensive of the war through the Ardennes. The Ardennes had become the focus of all Hitler's hopes. His plan was to muster an army that would deliver a surprise counter-offensive over the Christmas of 1944. The shock of an unexpected German attack would, he hoped, threaten the fragile alliance between the British, Americans and Soviets and cause it to collapse. Meanwhile, the German army could capture Antwerp, the main supply port for the Allied armies in the West, and so force the British, Canadian and American armies to evacuate to Britain, or, better still, surrender. The trouble was that Hitler's plan was fatally flawed. It assumed too much, was born out of desperation, and was full of ifs and buts. The German generals certainly had no faith in it, but had little choice but to carry it out. How, they probably asked themselves, was an army outnumbered 4-1 supposed to carry out this attack successfully? And what if the Allied alliance didn't collapse?
If Hitler separated them, then he could encircle and destroy the Americans or the British. But he didn't think about the fact that the Americans had 3 times as many weapons as us, and countless tanks, planes, ammunition, and above all else, fuel. And we couldn't get at their fuel dumps.
The offensive was fraught with difficulties from the very start. If the planned objectives were to be achieved, speed was vital, and the thickly wooded Ardennes region was hardly ideal for rapid movements of men and tanks, something that the German soldiers already knew through fighting off American attacks in the area.
Warfare was not dynamic here. The advantage of tanks and trucks and so on, and even jeeps, was lost in the forest.
During the attack then, emphasis was on securing the vital road network which cut through the Ardennes. Travelling on the roads, though, was risky for the German armour, as the Allies easily held air superiority in the region. This is why Hitler deliberately waited for winter to attack, as he believed that that was when most of the Allied air force would be grounded. But the timing of the attack was another indication of Hitler's muddled thinking. The weather took no one side. The atrocious conditions that hampered the Allies also made life hell for the Germans. The other main problem for the Germans was supply. Chronically short of fuel, ammunition and artillery, they were told to capture their own fuel as they advanced, and this slowed the all-important Panzer tanks. In contrast, the Allies were very well supplied. However, there was one crucial factor that worked very much in the Germans' favour. The Ardennes sector was thinly defended, held by inexperienced or battle-weary US troops. Ludwig Lindemann was part of the German 26th Volksgrenadier Division, which had recently been moved to the Ardennes region. He knew he would soon be part of a major offensive in that area.
We made continuous observations, and during the trips I made back to the regimental command post, I saw that large amounts of artillery and tanks had been set up everywhere in the woods to the east, behind the west wall. Even in the villages, ammunition and tank shells were piled up under covers, together with countless canisters. 20-litre canisters, or larger, lined the edges of the roads in the woods and villages.
We were there with one objective, and this objective was that to throw back the attacking forces to Belgium in order to guard our fatherland, yeah, because these forces were on our ground, and that was quite different than fighting with them in France or in Belgium or the Netherlands or in Luxembourg. And that is actually of which I think kept the fighting spirit up.
The Ardennes Offensive is better known to history as the Battle of the Bulge. And this is just what the Germans planned to create, a huge bulge in the Belgian countryside that would split the Allied forces. To the south was the US Army under General George Patton, while to the north were the British under Field Marshal Montgomery. On the morning of the 16th of December 1944, a huge German artillery barrage opened up along a front almost 85 miles long. Ludwig Lindemann was on the front line. His unit's objective was the village of Hosingen.
It was said afterwards that 30,000 shells fell on Hosingen. I couldn't count them, but it was terrible. The ground shook. You thought the world was coming to an end because it was happening just in front of us. And when the last artillery gun had stopped firing, we were told, company advance.
Although intended mainly to surprise and confuse the Allies, the bombardment created gaps in their lines into which the Germans poured troops, isolating some Allied positions, killing large numbers, and taking many prisoner.
Ich sah noch, wie ich durch den
As I advanced through the gardens of Hosingen,
Häuser von Hosingen, durch die Gärten, da weiter
I saw several Americans running out of the houses to the rear,
aus den Häusern nach rückwärts wegliefen.
2 of them in their underclothes.
Nur in ihren Unterzeug. Die waren gar nicht mehr
They hadn't even had time to put on their uniforms,
Wir suchten uns zunächst mal mit
trying to get out of our line of fire.
aus unserem Schussfeld rauszukommen.
The attack certainly came as a shock to the Allies, who struggled at first to get information that would provide a full picture of the position at the front. It is true that the Ardennes still holds the record as the biggest surrender of troops in American military history. But nevertheless, the US forces grimly held on to strategically vital positions, such as Elsenborn Ridge in the north and Bastogne in the south.
Das ging denn aber an sich doch ziemlich
We
flott.
advanced quite speedily,
Waren wir voran, hatten aber dann auch
but also
wieder
had the first
Verluste,
losses.
denn, wie man erwartet
The
hatte,
expectation
dass
that the
der
Americans would
Paderborn
abandon their
schnell
positions
da die Stellungen aufgeben
proved to be
würden,
an
das
error
war
of judgment on our
Fehl-
part.
Das war ein Fehlurteil von deutscher Seite aus. Wir haben sich ja doch hartnäckig
They defended
verteidigt, was man
tenaciously.
eigentlich auch bewusst haben musste.
We should have known that following the fighting on the Atlantic
Dem
coast.
Von dem Unternehmen da von Nordatlantikküste her.
The American resistance at Elsenborn in particular was vital. Without the capture of the ridge, the Germans could not drive on to cross the river Meuse, which had to be done quickly if they were to press on to Antwerp. The only German formation to make real progress in this area was a force of 4,000 infantry and 100 tanks called Kampfgruppe Peiper, which, although it pushed deep into Belgian territory, was completely alone and unsupported. It was Kampfgruppe Peiper that became involved in one of the war's most notorious incidents, an episode that typified the savagery of the fighting in the Ardennes, and which still causes debate today. It happened near Malmedy. On the 17th of December, an American patrol discovered the frozen bodies of nearly 100 of their countrymen lying in the snow, clearly as a result of a massacre. The Americans were, not surprisingly, horrified. They accused the Germans of a murderous, cold-blooded war crime. The Germans insisted that the troops were shot trying to escape. Whatever happened, it now seemed that the barbarous nature of the fighting on the Eastern Front had been imported to the war in the West. And some days after the Malmedy incident, another grisly scene was uncovered by British troops in the small Belgian village of Bande.
A civilian came up to me, waving his arms in the air, you know, and waving to me. He obviously wanted me to go along with him. He got me to a house where the house seemed to be collapsed. And then he got in and he went in, so I followed. And looked in, and then when I looked under the roof, which had been collapsed, there was a smell that was unpleasant in spite of the cold. And I looked in, I could see various bodies.
The innocent civilians in the house had been killed by the Gestapo, in retribution for a partisan attack in the area the previous September, when 3 German soldiers had been killed. American troops had liberated Banda before the Germans could respond, but in the Ardennes Offensive the village had been retaken by the Germans and old scores brutally settled. Gordon Newton was among the British troops who'd found the murdered civilians.
If you look round now, that doorway was as it is now, and underneath this memorial there is a cellar. And just before dusk, 30 young men, the youngest of the community, were marched along this road in threes, halted and told to face the road. Whereupon a Feldwebel, I think he's about sergeant, went to the last man and touched him on the shoulder, brought him here, presented him to that doorway, and as he came through the doorway, an officer shot him behind the ear and tossed him in the cellar. This is the cellar where the martyrs actually lay. This monument was built with a picture of each of the martyrs. But when they got the bodies out, they couldn't get them into the coffins because they were in such grotesque positions. So we had to break the arms, cut the tendons, and we finally got them into their coffins.
I heard about liquidation commands of the security service going around. I think this wasn't the only incidents. There were others, and that's just one thing. You see, German army people looked actually, I should say, disrespect on the security service. Nevertheless, it served under the German flag, and in that respect, I think we should be ashamed of these people who performed such a cruel, unjustifiable act.
By the 19th of December, the surprise element of the German attack had gone, and it began to become more and more fragmented. The Americans, who had taken the brunt of the assault, had performed heroically, particularly as they were so inexperienced. Many were cooks and hospital orderlies, pressed by the desperate situation into taking up arms. Some of the most heroic defending by the US forces was at Bastogne. For the Germans, it was vital to take this town in order to control the road network in the area. Without it, their attack would soon peter out.
On some tanks it was written in chalk, "See you in Paris." We thought, oh, they're brave. It won't be that easy to get down there, because we knew what our speed of advance had been. We should already have been beyond Bastogne, according to the attack plan laid down by the Führer headquarters.
On the 19th of December, the Allies held a conference at Verdun to decide a strategy to push back the German advance. It was decided that the counterattack would be made from the south by 3 divisions of General Patton's 3rd Army. There were now 2 distinct battles, one to the north and one to the south. Field Marshal Montgomery assumed responsibility for all operations in the north, immediately bringing up the British 30 Corps as reinforcements.
2 o'clock one morning, the alarm went up, everybody jumped in the trucks, back up to Brussels, reload your tanks, put the guns back in, put the wireless back in, load up ammunition, going up to the Ardennes. So we went up by road. Oh, we had to whitewash the tanks because the Ardennes was covered in snow. And when we got there, we were in a little town called Namur.
Every battle-ready soldier in England was brought here to endeavour not only to stem the tide, but to push the Germans back. And we travelled incognito because we were airborne division, and we had to come along with our berets inside out, with our insignia missing, so we looked like ordinary infantry troops, because they felt that if Hitler realised the desperation in bringing specialist troops over here, it might have made him change his mind and try and keep going.
Montgomery was an experienced campaigner who now had, despite his differences with others in Allied command, a reputation for getting things done. His was a steadying influence as the Allies sought to seize the initiative from the Germans.
We were lorried up to a place called Humaine. And when we went into this village, you thought it'd be atom bombed. It was only a small village. There was American tanks lying about, destroyed, lorries, jeeps, tanks, and we were distributed into various directions. And my particular company went forward up onto a ridge which overlooked the German positions.
The weather at the start of the offensive, which had been cold and wet, was now freezing. With snow now falling, it made life difficult for both the Allies and the Germans.
Within a few days you had about 2 feet of snow, and it was getting colder and colder and colder. And there was only one advantage, and that is that the mechanism of the mines had totally frozen, and so they didn't do any harm anymore. But in the foxholes, every morning they picked up a few fellows who had fallen asleep and were stiff and dead.
The main snag that we experienced was our airborne smocks were green and brown and were rather obvious against the white snow, which we didn't like, particularly when we were patrolling. And we had to, shall I say, requisition a number of white sheets, which we improvised as a sort of cloak to cover our dark colours.
I remember one thing we learned very quickly, and that was that when a field is covered with ice and snow, you don't know there's a pond in the middle, because one of our guys found out, and they were up to the turret in freezing cold water. So we were told in future, if you've got to cross a field, take to the hedges, because it's unlikely to have a pond up to the hedges, but it don't go straight across a field.
Erstmal kam der Nachschub nicht so schnell.
First of all, the supplies didn't get through so fast on the narrow roads of the Ardennes, where it's hilly. And in the meantime, the winter had set in. The roads froze and were covered in ice.
Although the end was in sight for Hitler's last offensive in the West, there were still some extraordinary episodes to be played out. One involved the German 150th Panzer Brigade, ordered to penetrate deep behind the Allied lines, with the express aim of creating panic and confusion in the Allied ranks. They were also told to capture and hold vital river crossings, long enough for the main army to reach them. What made the 150th Panzer Brigade so remarkable was that it made use of captured American jeeps and adapted German tanks so that they would look like those used by the Americans.
They were managing to capture American vehicles, uniforms, and dog tags, identity tags, and come over the bridge into our area disguised as Americans. And unless they opened their mouth, you didn't know that Americans were waving them on over the bridge. And it was Germans.
As small units were stopped and arrested by suspicious Americans, the rumor started that large numbers of Germans were operating behind the lines, posing as friendly forces.
In the end, it got so uncertain and so unsafe that they said, right, at midnight tomorrow, anybody the other side of that river, any American's been told he's got to make it to this side by midnight, and after that, whatever comes over those bridges, you blow up. And it doesn't matter if it's got the stars and stripes on it, you will blow it up.
Sometimes, though, the Germans didn't even need to disguise themselves to be mistaken for Americans, especially in the dense forest of the Ardennes.
See, one of the problems we had was that the German helmet, at times, looks not unlike an American helmet.
Yeah.
And on 2 occasions, we walked into a German unit, you know, thinking they were Americans. Over there, and they weren't over there at all. It was the flipping Germans. And we found ourselves in a tight situation because we thought they were Americans.
Despite these dramas, the German Ardennes Offensive was now reaching its high watermark. The Allies were able to reinforce their positions with many more men and supplies. The Germans had no such luxury. All in all, the Allies were able to commit the equivalent of 35 fresh divisions to the battle. The Germans managed to scrape together just 8. By the 23rd of December, the weather had lifted enough for the Allies to be able to resume air attacks, and another nail was hammered into the German army's coffin.
Bis dahin, es war der 21. oder 22. wohl, da war es ja
Up
noch
until the
regnet.
21st and
Es war
22nd, it was
wie so
raining.
Schnäppchen,
Sleet was
Schnäppchen,
falling, which froze at
also
night.
Schnee mit Regen vermischt, fuhr aber nachts
But it was
schon,
misty, so
war
that
aber
enemy
nie
planes
so,
weren't
dass,
able to fly large-scale missions,
gegnerische Flugzeuge gar nicht groß
which was to our
zum
advantage,
Einsatz
of course.
kommen konnten. Das war natürlich unser Vorteil. Dadurch hatten wir aus der
We didn't need to
Luft von
expect
oben
anything from the air
zunächst
during those
diese Tage
days.
nicht zu erwarten. Das änderte sich aber, ich meine,
That changed on about the 22nd or 23rd, just before Christmas.
oder am 23. auch. Wie das Wetter
So that the
aufnahm,
American and
dann
British Air
werden
Forces gave us a
die
great deal of trouble.
amerikanischen Flugzeuge dann auch große Schwierigkeiten noch von der Luftwaffe her.
All along the front, the attack was faltering or had ground to a halt. By Christmas Eve, even Kampfgruppe Piper was completely cut off, out of fuel and out of hope. The surrounded American troops at Bastogne had welcomed the arrival of the clear skies. From the air, supplies now reached them, and enemy positions could be attacked by Allied fighter planes and bombers. The German soldiers could only look on helplessly.
Es ging ja nun auf Weihnachten zu und Bastogne hatten wir
Christmas
dann,
was
wie ich
approaching,
vorhin schon sagte, ganz
and we had
abgeschlossen.
completely encircled
Und da
Bastogne.
sahen wir denn, das war wohl am 23. und 24.
And on the 23rd or 24th,
dass die Amerikaner in riesigen
we saw the Americans bringing over
Flugzeugen
huge formations of transport gliders,
und auch die Lastensegler vor
and the
unseren
gliders
Linien
landed in front of our
an den
lines at the edge of
Stadträndern von
Bastogne,
Bastogne landeten, noch auf
on American-held territory,
und dort dann
bringing in food, ammunition, all kinds of
Verpflegungsmunition
supplies.
und alle möglichen Versorgungsgüter brachten.
On the 26th of December, news reached Allied command that General Patton had finally broken through the German ring around Bastogne and was holding open a corridor so further men and supplies could reinforce the town.
Wir konnten also von der 26. das nicht ganz allein halten. Wir hatten dadurch auch
We of the
viel Unterstützung.
26th couldn't hold it
An
on
uns
our own.
vorbeigestoßen war die Panzerlehrdivision südlich.
We did
und
have
die zweite
support.
Panzerdivision,
The
die
Panzer-Lehr Division passed us to the south, and the 2nd Panzer Division was almost at the River Maas by
aber der
then,
Nachschub
but
fehlte
supplies didn't
und
arrive.
teilweise dann
And from then on, we were in
dann
retreat.
von da an ging es ja rückwärts.
The 26th of December also saw the Germans reach the very farthest point of the advance into Belgium. It came in the south, at Celle, although a few tanks had struggled on as far as Dinant the previous day, but were turned back by British 30 Corps. This was the end. The Germans were almost out of fuel and had lost so many troops it was impossible to go on. Gordon Newton remembers the turning of the tide.
The British troops were on this ridge and the Germans were down in the dip, and we heard them moving out and began to chase them. We let them have a couple of days start and then we went after them.
Da hatte der Amerikaner unheimlich viele Panzer aufgefahren und auch Infanterie.
The Americans had brought up huge numbers of tanks and infantry, and we had very high losses, so that the company was almost completely wiped out. The commanders of the individual groups were dead. There were no more platoon commanders, or they had been captured by the Americans.
The only man in German high command who could not see the hopelessness of the situation was Adolf Hitler, and as he did at El Alamein and in Normandy, he issued another order to stand and fight. The Bulge, said the Führer, must be held as a base for further planned offensives. The order was almost laughable, as what remained of his armies were already being steadily pushed back. Only the cautious approach of the Allies and the weather stopped the advance being made at higher speed. Ludwig Lindemann had had enough, but whilst retreating with what remained of his company, he was stopped by a German military police patrol near the Belgium-German border and ordered to turn around.
Da wollten uns die da Oberbefehlshaber sagt auch halt. Und sagte, wir müssen
The Sergeant Major said that we had to stop and gather together for a new mission.
Da können Sie hingehen und wenn Sie nicht weggehen, ich suche meine Pistole.
I said, you can go, and if you don't get out of my way, I drew my pistol. I'm not going to the left or the right, I'm going straight on. We have come from the front and are the remains of a company. Well, he said after a long talk, if you want to, I'll step aside. I said, you're lucky.
From the air, the Allied planes rained death and destruction on the German army, just as they had during the battles for Normandy. A glimmer of hope came at the beginning of January when the Luftwaffe made its own attacks on Allied airfields, destroying some 300 Allied aircraft. These were costly raids, though. More than 100 aircraft and 200 precious pilots were lost. The costs eventually far outweighed the gains, and the raids were stopped. Hitler did launch smaller offensives to try and secure the Bulge. On New Year's Eve 1944, Operation Nordwind, involving some 10 divisions, huffed and puffed with no success. The following day, 1,000 fighters and fighter bombers made a low-level attack in what was called Operation Bodenplatte. Many were shot from the sky. On the 28th of January, the Ardennes Offensive, the Battle of the Bulge, was declared officially over, and Adolf Hitler was left to count the cost of his last great gamble. He had decided to go on the offensive in the Ardennes, despite all advice to the contrary, and the German army had paid the price.
I think we all felt we were a damn sight better than the other side, and there was no question. The question never arose that who would win. And the point is, well, we'd go on to the end.
When we ordinary soldiers saw that a victory for the German army was no longer possible, peace should have been negotiated around Bastogne, whatever the terms. The lives of many victims would have been spared.
More than 100,000 German troops had been killed or wounded during the battle. 2/3 of German tanks had been lost. All German reserve armies had been wiped out. There were none left. Germany was virtually powerless to stop the relentless Russian advance on Berlin, the fall of which was now only a few weeks away. Allied losses during the Ardennes Offensive amounted to more than 80,000 men, the vast majority of whom were American. Their sacrifices ensured that Hitler's dream of prolonging the war was shattered, and that in the spring of 1945, Germany was finally defeated.